Cora Ashby counted the wall gaps the way other women counted eggs. 3 fingers wide here, 2 there, one long crack running from the sill almost to her shoulder. A long run of the old daubing, some of it laid by her father, had finally come away in her hands like stale bread, and she'd been counting the gaps since August. She had meant to fix it in September. Then the hay needed cutting. Then the fence line needed mending, where the Hendersons' cattle had pushed through. Then it was October, and daylight still showed through the north wall in 4 places, and her father was 7 months in the ground at the little cemetery past the second creek crossing. She was on the roof checking the shingles when she saw the rider. She knew the horse before she knew the man, a rangy bay gelding that had spent most of the previous summer tied outside her father's barn, while its owner built out the stalls her father had never gotten around to building himself. Ezra Doane. She hadn't seen him since the funeral, where he'd stood at the back and said almost nothing, which she had appreciated more than anything anyone else said that day. She climbed down before he reached the yard. "Miss Ashby." He didn't get off the horse right away. "I was headed through before the passes close up. Thought I'd settle what your father still owed me." Cora felt her stomach tighten. She hadn't touched the account book since the funeral. She wasn't even certain what page it was on, let alone what it said. "I can get you the ledger," she said. "I don't know exactly what he—" "I know what he owed." Ezra swung down from the horse. "That's not why I'm here to argue. I'm here to square it before I head on." He said it plainly, the way a man reads off a list, and something in Cora's chest loosened slightly. Not trust, not yet, just the absence of a fight she'd been bracing for. She found the ledger inside, dust thick on its cover, and read him the figure her father had written last. Ezra shook his head before she'd finished the sentence. "Your father paid me $6. He said it like a correction, not a claim. Last year, in August." Cora turned back a page, then another, and found it. A single line in her father's hand, tucked where she never would have looked for it. August 1882. Doane, $6. She looked up at him. It was only then that his eyes moved past her to the wall behind her shoulder, to the long crack running from the sill. He looked at the sky once, flat gray, moving fast from the northwest, then back at the gap. "You planning to winter in that?" "I wintered in worse." Ezra looked once more toward the northwest, where the clouds had started piling against the mountains. "That wasn't what I asked." Ezra crossed the yard without being asked, and put his palm flat against the log wall just below the long crack. He didn't say anything for a moment. He moved his hand an inch, then another, feeling for the give in the wood, the places where the old daubing had pulled away clean, and the places where it still clung in crumbling patches like scabbed-over wounds. "How long has it been open like this?" "Since August." Cora stood a few feet back, arms crossed against the wind picking up out of the northwest. "I meant to get to it." "I didn't ask that either." He crouched to look at the sill, where the gap widened before it disappeared under the log. "I asked how long it's been open." She didn't answer that one. He didn't push. He straightened and looked past her, toward the road she'd watched him ride in on, the same road that ran another 6 miles to the Cathcart place, where he'd told the old man he'd take a bed for the night before pushing on toward the rail junction. He looked at that road for longer than he looked at the wall. Then he looked at the sky again. The clouds had thickened since he'd first ridden up, pressing lower against the peaks, moving faster than clouds that far off had any business moving. 6 miles, he said, mostly to himself. "What?" "Nothing." He turned back to the wall. "I'm not going to make Cathcarts tonight, not in front of that." Cora followed his eyes to the horizon and understood, in the plain arithmetic way he'd clearly already done it, that he wasn't offering to stay. He was telling her he had no choice, the same way a man tells you a bridge is out. If the weather turned before he cleared the pass, he'd be caught in it, same as anyone. and a house with 4 gaps in the north wall wasn't going to keep either of them warm tonight, whether he liked her or not, whether she wanted his help or not. "You'll want to bed the horse in the barn," Cora said. "There's room." "I know there's room. I built half of it." It wasn't unkind, the way he said it, just a fact, laid down the way he'd laid down the $6 earlier, correcting the record, nothing more. They stood a moment in the wind before either of them moved toward the woodpile. "Show me what you've got to work with," Ezra said. She led him around to the lean-to where her father had kept his tools, most of them untouched since spring. There was a half-used sack of dry clay, gone hard in patches where damp had gotten into the seams, a smaller sack of ash from the hearth, straw, plenty of it, baled and dry in the loft, a bucket with a crust of old mortar dried around the rim, the last batch her father had ever mixed, still sitting where he'd left it. Ezra picked through the pile without touching that bucket. "No lime?" "We never bought much, never needed it," Papa said. "The clay held fine on its own most years." "It held fine because somebody kept after it every spring." He turned the bag of clay over, checking the dampness of it with his thumb. "This'll work. Not enough of it dry, though. We'll need to break up what's hardened and remix it, and it'll take twice as long as fresh." He didn't say it like a complaint. He said it like a man taking stock before a job, counting hours the way Cora counted eggs. "How many walls need doing?" "All 4 gaps are on the north side. West corner's got one bad spot too, where the wind gets in around the window frame. There's cracks on the east and south sides as well, but they're narrower. Nothing that's let real wind through so far." "Then that's where we start. North first, west corner if there's time." He looked at the sky once more, briefly, the way he kept doing, like a man checking a clock that only he could read. "There won't be time for the rest. Not today." Cora wanted to ask how he could be so certain, watching clouds that still looked, to her eye, like clouds that came every October and passed without much trouble. But she had lived through enough Octobers now to know that certainty, in a man who built things for a living, usually came from somewhere worth trusting. She picked up the bucket of old dried mortar and carried it to the wall without being told to. The old mortar in the bucket was no good. Ezra confirmed that within a minute of working his thumb into it, finding nothing but a dry, sandy crumble that fell apart before it ever touched the wall. He set it aside without ceremony and had Cora break up the hardened clay instead, working it in a shallow trough with water carried up from the well, while he went to work on the gaps themselves. "Wood first," he said, holding up a split length of pine he'd cut down to size. "Wedge it in tight before anything wet goes near it. Otherwise you're just packing mud into open air, and open air doesn't hold anything." He fit the piece into the widest part of the crack near the sill, angling it, tapping it home with the flat of his hand until it sat flush. Then he stepped back and pointed at the narrower gaps above it. "Those get moss packed in tight, or whatever soft enough to fill without falling through. You've got any of that?" Cora thought of the sack of dried moss her father kept in the tack room, saved every fall against exactly this need, and went to fetch it while Ezra kept working the wood blocking into the lower gaps. By the time she came back, her hands damp from working the moss soft again in a bucket of water, he'd worked halfway down the wall. She copied what she'd seen him do, packing the soft filler around the wood, pressing it in with her fingers until it resisted, the way a good stitch resists a needle. He watched her do the first one without comment. When she finished the second, he only said, "Tighter at the corners," and moved on. They worked that way for the better part of an hour, saying little, the wind picking up steadily enough now that Cora had to raise her voice to be heard over it. She found she didn't mind the quiet between the words. It was a different kind of quiet than the one that had settled over the house since spring. This one had a shape to it, a rhythm, hers and his moving in something like time with each other. When the wood and filler were packed into the first 6 feet of wall, Ezra finally turned to the clay. "Now the mud." He crouched by the trough Cora had mixed and worked 2 fingers into it, testing the give. "Not too wet. If it runs, it won't hold in the gap, If it's too dry, it won't stick to the wood at all. He added a palmful of water, worked it through, added another. Cora watched his hands the way she used to watch her father's, not out of nothing to do, but because there was something in the working of it that asked to be watched, the same as bread dough turning from shaggy to smooth. "Small batch," he said, when she reached to add more clay to the trough than he'd used. "We're not going to get through all of this before it skins over. It's just mud. It's mud that dries the second it hits open air in this wind." He held up his own hands, the crust already forming at his knuckles from the last handful. "Mix what we can use in the next while, no more." She mixed less. He didn't explain further, and she found she didn't need him to. The proof was right there on his hands, drying to a pale crust even as he worked. They moved down the wall together after that, a rhythm setting in without either of them naming it. Ezra pressing a handful of the daubing into a packed gap, working it in with his thumb, smoothing the surface flat with 2 fingers drawn firm along the wood. Cora mixing behind him, keeping the batches small, bringing fresh clay before the last of it dried past use. The wind kept building. Twice Ezra stopped to look north toward the mountains, where the gray had gone the color of a bruise low along the ridgeline. Both times he said nothing and went back to work, but Cora noticed his hands moved a little faster after each look, and she matched her own pace to his without deciding to. By the time the light started going gold and long across the yard, too early for the hour, she thought, though she didn't say it, they'd closed 4 feet of the worst gaps and were working toward the window corner, where the wind found its way in loudest. "West corner next," Ezra said, wiping his hands on his trousers before crouching by a fresh section. "That window frame's letting more cold through than all 4 wall gaps put together." Cora looked at the corner he meant, the one her father had always meant to reset the frame on, the one she'd never gotten to either, and said nothing about that either. She just carried the trough over and started mixing. The west corner gap was deeper than the others, nearly the width of 2 fingers, where the window frame had pulled away from the log over the years. A wound that went back further into the wall than anything they'd packed so far. Ezra fit the wood blocking into it the same as before, but this one took longer. 3 separate pieces angled and tapped until they held. "This one's slow," he said. "Don't rush the mud on it." He left her with it and moved further down the wall to check the sections they'd already closed, testing each one with a knuckle, the way a man checks bread for doneness. Cora watched him go, then looked at the gap in front of her, deep, ragged, the wind finding it easily, even with the wood packed in, and thought of how much wall was still left, and how the light was already sliding toward evening, and how her father would have had this whole side finished by now, if he were the one crouched here, instead of her. She packed the soft filler in first, moss worked soft with water, pressed snug around the wood the way he'd shown her on the first gaps, then reached for the daubing. She mixed a full batch, more than Ezra had been using, and pressed it into the gap in one thick handful, working it deep to fill the hollow behind the wood the way she thought made sense. More mud, more coverage, done faster. It held for the length of time it took her to move 6 inches down the wall and start on the next section. Then it didn't. She heard it before she saw it, a soft, wet sound, like something exhaling, and turned to find the whole patch sagging outward, pulling loose from the wood behind it, a slab of it dropping to the dirt at her feet. Damn it! Ezra was there within a few strides, crouching to look at what had fallen rather than at her. He picked up the dropped piece, turned it over in his hand, then looked at the hollow left behind. "You packed it in one lift." He said it without heat, the way he'd said everything else that day. A fact, laid down plain, too thick to hold itself against the log. It needs to go in shallow, dry some, then another layer on top of that, not all at once. "I didn't have time to do it twice." "You don't have time not to." He pressed 2 fingers into the wood blocking still seated in the gap, and one side of it gave slightly under the pressure. Not loose, but not fully home either. This piece isn't seated tight enough either. That's part of why it let go. Mud's only as good as what's behind it. Cora looked at the mess at her feet, the wasted clay, the darkening sky, and felt something rise in her chest that had nothing to do with the wall. The old, familiar weight of not knowing something her father would have known without thinking, of standing in his tools and his half-finished work and finding herself short of what he'd have had ready in his hand. She didn't say any of that. She picked up the trowel instead. "Show me." Ezra reseated the loose piece of wood, working it deeper with the heel of his hand until it held firm against his testing fingers. Then he stepped back. "Thin layer first. Let it start to set before you go back over it." She mixed a smaller batch and pressed it in shallow the way he'd said, resisting the urge to fill the whole gap at once. It felt wrong to her hands, too slow, too little to show for the effort. But she did it anyway, working the thin layer into the hollow and smoothing it flat. "Now leave it," Ezra said. "Work the next section. We'll come back to this one before dark." They moved down the wall that way, Cora circling back every so often to add another thin layer to the deep corner, watching each one hold this time, the mud gripping the wood and the layer beneath it instead of sliding free. By the third pass, the gap had closed to something she could press a palm against and feel solid resistance instead of give. She didn't say anything about her father, neither did Ezra. But somewhere in the third or fourth thin layer, working the trowel the way he'd shown her, she found herself thinking of him anyway. Not the version of him in the ground past the second creek crossing, but the version who used to crouch at this same corner every fall, cursing at the same drafty window frame, telling her mother he'd get to the lime next spring, and never quite doing it. She had never once, in all the autumns she'd watched him do this, thought to ask him how. "You're getting it," Ezra said, checking her latest layer with a knuckle and finding it held. It wasn't praise, not really, just another fact laid down plain. But Cora found she wanted to hear it again anyway, and didn't examine that wanting too closely, and went back to mixing the next batch instead. They had nearly closed the west corner as the light went fully gold, then amber, then the flat gray of a sky about to lose the sun early. The wind had stopped gusting and settled into something steadier and colder, a wind with intention behind it, and Cora found herself working faster without Ezra having to say anything about it. By the time they'd closed the last of the north wall gaps, her hands had gone stiff enough that she had to work her fingers before she could hold the trowel right. Ezra's were worse, cracked at 2 knuckles where the cold and the clay had gotten into the skin, though he hadn't said a word about it, and she hadn't asked. "That's the north side done," he said, stepping back to look at the wall in the fading light. "Solid. It'll hold." "And the rest of the house?" "Not tonight." He nodded toward the east and south walls, still marked with the few narrow cracks she'd shown him earlier, none of them facing the wind the way the north side did. "Those can wait for weather that doesn't punish you for taking your time." Cora went inside to check the stove and to write, out of a habit she hadn't examined closely, the day's work into the ledger the same way her father always had. Dates, names, the small economy of the ranch kept in his careful hand for 30 years before her. She sat at the table and opened to the current page and wrote, without thinking much about it. October 27th, Doane, half day. She was still holding the pen when Ezra came in for a length of rope from the peg by the door and saw the book open in front of her. Saw what she'd written before she could think to close it. He didn't say anything at first. He got the rope. He was most of the way back to the door before he stopped. "What's that?" "What?" "What you just wrote." He nodded at the ledger. "Doane, half day. What's that for?" Cora felt the same tightening in her stomach she'd felt that afternoon, waiting for him to name the number her father owed. "Your hours, today's work." "For what?" "What do you think it's for?" She heard her own voice go sharper than she meant it to. "You're not doing this for nothing." Ezra set the coil of rope down on the table, slow, like a man setting down something he didn't trust himself not to drop wrong. I came here to settle an account, not open a new one. I didn't ask you to fix my wall for free. You didn't ask me to fix it at all. His voice hadn't risen, but something in it had gone flatter, harder to read. I looked at it, I decided. That's not a debt, Miss Ashby. That's a man doing a day's work because the alternative was standing here watching you freeze. I don't want charity. I'm not offering charity. He said it like the words cost him something. I'm offering help. You keep writing it into that book like it's the same thing your father owed me, and it isn't. It's not the same account. It's the only kind of account I know how to keep. The words came out before she'd decided to say them, and once they were out, she found she couldn't take them back, and didn't especially want to. I don't know how else to make it even. Something in his face shifted then. Not softened exactly, but stilled, like a man reconsidering ground he'd thought was solid. It doesn't have to be even, he said. Not everything does. Everything I've got left does. Cora looked down at the ledger, at her father's handwriting above her own, at the neat column of figures that had kept this ranch honest for longer than she'd been alive. It's the one thing of his I can still keep exact. Ezra didn't answer that right away. He looked at her for a moment, then at the ledger, then out the window at the wind bending the grass flat against the yard. Leave it be for now, he said finally. The book, the wall, both of them. He nodded toward the window, where the gray had gone the deep charcoal of full evening, though it was hours yet before true dark. Weather's turning faster than I like. We've got maybe another hour we can still work wet mud before the cold makes it useless. After that, it won't matter what the ledger says about anybody's hours. We'll be doing something else entirely. Cora closed the book without writing anything more, though she didn't put it away, and followed him back out into the wind. They worked another 40 minutes on the west corner's last thin layer, the wind rising steadily enough now that Cora had to shout the one time she asked Ezra to hold a board steady while she packed behind it. The clay was drying strange in her hands, too fast on the surface, still soft underneath, the way bread goes when the oven runs hotter than it should. Ezra noticed it before she said anything. He pressed a thumb into the layer they'd finished 20 minutes earlier and felt it, some give still there under a skin that looked set. He didn't press further. He straightened up and looked north, and this time he held the look longer than he had all day. That's it, he said. No more wet work tonight. We're not done. There's still... I know what's still open. He was already moving toward the lean-to, pulling his coat tighter against a gust that carried the first hard grains of something that wasn't quite rain. And it's going to stay open till the weather lets us back at it. If we keep pushing mud into that wall now, it freezes before it sets, and it comes apart worse than if we'd never touched it. I've seen it happen. Wasted work is worse than no work. Cora looked at the narrow cracks still waiting on the east and south walls, and at the last unfinished seams around the west corner, and felt the same useless anger she'd felt when the first patch fell. Not at Ezra, not really, but at the wall itself, at the weather, at a house that wouldn't hold still long enough to be finished. So what do we do? Everything that doesn't need to be wet. He was already pulling wood scraps from the pile they hadn't used, splitting them down with quick strokes of the hatchet into thin wedges. Pack these dry into what's left open at the corner. It won't seal it, but it'll break the wind enough to matter tonight. We finish it right when the weather turns. They worked fast after that, the last daylight going gray and then gone, the wind loud enough now that they mostly stopped talking altogether and just moved. Ezra splitting and wedging wood into the last unfinished seams around the west corner, packing them tight with dry moss where he could. Cora hauling in the split wood from the pile outside, the dry cores of logs that had spent all summer seasoning under the lean-to roof, stacking them by the stove where they'd stay dry through whatever came. The first real gust hit as she was hauling the last armload in, hard enough that she had to plant her feet against it, snow riding sideways in it now, not falling so much as traveling. "Door," Ezra called, and she got it shut and barred behind her. The wind immediately finding every seam in the frame and whistling through them thin and high. He checked the shutters next, the 2 windows on the north side that didn't have glass behind them, just oiled cloth stretched tight. One had come loose at a corner, and he re-nailed it fast, 3 strikes of the hammer, while Cora held the cloth taut against the wind, trying to tear it from her hands. Then the stovepipe, checked for draw, damped down enough to hold heat without choking on itself. Then the roof, or as much of it as could be checked from inside. Ezra standing on a chair with a lamp held up to the rafters over the north side, checking the joints and boards for movement or fresh damp where the wind pressed hardest, and finding none. "Roof sound," he said, climbing down. "Whatever your father did up there, he did it right." It was the closest thing to a kindness he'd offered all evening about the man, and Cora found it landed harder than she expected, standing there with her arms full of firewood and snow melting cold down the back of her collar. They ate standing up, bread and the last of a cured ham, because sitting felt like admitting the work was done when it wasn't. There was still the horse to check on. One more time, out through the barn door with a lantern held low against the wind. Both of them moving together now, without needing to say who'd do what. Ezra checked the gelding's blanket and the latch on the stall. Cora forked down fresh hay and checked the water hadn't started to skin over yet. By the time they came back inside, the wind had a sound to it that hadn't been there an hour before. A long, steady note underneath the gusts. The sound of something settling in rather than passing through. "That's the storm," Ezra said, setting the lantern down and working the stiffness out of his hands, the cracked knuckles gone raw and red now from the cold. Not before it. In it. Cora looked at the wall, the north side solid, the west corner packed, dry and holding. The 2 gaps still open on the east side, and a few narrower cracks on the south, where the wind couldn't reach as hard. It wasn't finished. It wasn't going to be finished tonight. Maybe not for days. But it was standing, and the wind that found its way through the remaining gaps came in as a whisper now instead of a current, and the stove held its heat, and neither of them said anything about any of it being enough. Because it wasn't, not yet. They sat on opposite sides of the stove and didn't talk for a long while, listening to the house hold against something that wanted very badly to get in. The wind dropped some time before dawn, not all at once, but by degrees. The long, steady note of it thinning until Cora woke to a silence so complete it felt like its own kind of sound. She lay still for a moment before she understood why. No whistling through the seams, no draft finding her where she'd banked the fire and pulled her blanket close to the stove. She found Ezra already up, standing at the north wall with the lamp still lit, though gray morning light was coming through the one clear pane of glass by the door. He had his palm flat against the wall again, the same as the first time he'd looked at it. But his face, when she came up beside him, wasn't the same. "It held," she said. Ezra nodded, then pointed to a section near the window corner, where 3 thin lines ran through the daubing they'd layered the evening before, hairline and pale against the darker clay around them. "That part will need patching." Cora leaned close. The cracks were shallow, barely wider than a hair, but they ran the length of the panel they'd worked hardest on, the one they'd rushed through before the cold shut them down. "Did we do it wrong?" Ezra looked at the cracks a moment longer before he answered. "No." He said it plainly, the way he said most things. "It means we'll have work when the weather turns." She wanted him to say more than that. Wanted some accounting of it, some ledger entry for what had gone right against what hadn't, but he only reached out and pressed a thumb against the cracked section, testing it the way he tested everything, and seemed satisfied enough with what he found. Outside, the yard was heaped white in drifts against the barn and the fence line, deep enough in places to bury the lower rail, but the storm itself had already begun breaking apart overhead. The sky gone the pale, scoured blue that came after the worst of an October system had spent itself. The horse had weathered it fine in the barn. The stovepipe had held, The roof hadn't leaked. They ate a slow breakfast, the first unhurried meal since he'd ridden up the day before, and Cora found herself watching the way he ate, carefully, without waste, a man used to making a meal last because he wasn't certain of the next one. When she cleared the plates, she got the ledger down from the shelf without being asked. Before she set it on the table, she opened it to the page and added one more line beneath the first, dated that morning. October 28th, Doane, morning. Then she set it open between them. Ezra looked at it, then at her, and didn't say anything. He found the 2 lines himself on the current page, both in Cora's hand. October 27th, Doane, half day. October 28th, Doane, morning. Ezra reached across the table, took the pen from where it sat in the fold of the book, and drew a single line through each entry. Not through the page, not through her father's older account further back, just those 2 lines, clean and final. That was your father's account, he said. This wasn't. Cora looked at the 2 crossed-out lines, at the blank space where a debt might have grown and hadn't, and found she didn't have anything to say to that either. Not gratitude, not argument. Just the quiet of a thing settled the way it should have been settled from the start. She looked past him instead, out the window, to the east wall of the house, still gapped in the 2 places they hadn't reached before the storm shut them down. How long would that side take? Ezra followed her look, considering the wall the way he'd considered it the first afternoon, not quickly, not carelessly, weighing it the way a man weighs any job before he commits to it. A day, he said, maybe 2. Cora thought of the ledger still open on the table, the blank space under the crossed-out lines, and understood that whatever she wrote there next would have to mean something different than what had come before. I can feed you for 2, she said. Ezra didn't answer right away. He looked at her, then at the wall, then back at her, and something in his face, not quite a smile, nothing so simple as that, settled into place. He picked up the hatchet from where it leaned against the door.